Hey guys, so that time of the month again where I do my take of a meta-analysis, where based on the top 25 ranked players on Dueling Book, I used ygeoscope.com to find their 20 most recent replays that were publicly available and outline what decks they were playing, as well as what the deck's win percentages were based on whether they won or lost the die roll, and how they fared depending on the deck's playstyle that they faced. Hopefully you guys don't get tired of these kind of videos because I plan on doing it monthly. But if you do like them, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more, and let's just get right into it. So to do this analysis, I first recorded who the top 25 ranked players on Dueling Book were on a given day. In this instance, it was January 3rd, 2021. Then, over the next few days, I went through 20 publicly available replays for each of those players and collected the relevant information. Now, the reason the total number of matches add up to 490 and not 500 is because some matches concluded before any card was played, which I excluded. And in rare instances, the available replay was for a single game and not for a full match, so I excluded that as well. Now keep in mind that 490 is still a really small sample size, but the best I can go with. So now based on the 490 matches included, assuming roughly 20 matches attributed to the same player, this was the breakdown of the decks played. Of course, the same player generally tended to play the same deck for all of their matches, but not always. So we see Drytron as the most played deck among all the matches analyzed for this video, with Virtual World coming in at a pretty close second. Then the representation just falls off, with Infernoble coming surprisingly at third. Despite the ban of Link Cross and Smoke Grenade, they can still put up a board of a couple negates and a pop with Charles, or can put up a VFD as well. Then we have Zodiac variants at around 7%, much lower than in my last month's meta-analysis. Dragon Link has fallen hard since the December ban list with the ban of Link Cross and Buster Whelp, but still seeing some play it seems. Then we have some other decks like Prank Kids, Altergeist, and Subterror, and I would say one surprise to see here is Heroes at around 4%. Certainly a nice rogue option, but during the pandemic we've just had so many powerful combo decks that other combo options like Heroes generally fell off to the side. So compared to the previous meta-analysis that I did, there was a lot of variety of decks played among the top 25 ranked players. We had several decks in the other category, which was below 3% for this video, where some notable decks included ABC, Salamangreat, Dogmatika Eldritch, and Dinosaur. Another thing I've been doing with these meta-analysis is to show what proportion of decks use the Dogmatika and or Eldritch engines. This time around, it was much lower than usual, with only about 2.5% of decks using a Dogmatika engine and less than 5% of decks using an Eldritch engine. In the last meta-analysis, you saw these numbers more so at the 12 to 15% range. Now compare this graph of our top 25 players to the overall number of decks being played on Dueling Book based on ygeoscope.com. Now at a first glance, you see Virtual World as the most played deck, but if you look closer, you will see a bunch of other decks that are technically still Drytron but categorized slightly different, like for example Cyber Angel, Drytron Herald, or Cyber Angel Drytron. If you were to add all these subcategories up, then Drytron is actually the most played deck online on Dueling Book right now overall, with about a 61% win rate. Then you have Dinosaur as still one of the most played decks online, but among our top 25 players, there were only a few matches where dinos were played. Same with Eldritch, very frequently played online overall, but not so much for our top 25 players, at least for the time point in January where I collected the data. To do a quick breakdown of the overall numbers, the top 25 players won 71% of their matches, and if we look at the playstyle of the decks played by these top ranked players, aggro decks were the most popular at 75%. Aggro decks include something like Virtual World and Drytrons, Infernoble and the like, and I know especially with Drytrons you could argue it's more of an aggro control-ish style, but I did categorize the decks based on how El Exordio del Duelista does them, just to have a standard of reference, so keep that in mind in terms of how the decks were categorized for this video. About 22% of the decks involve control decks like Zodiac and Eldritch decks, and finally, 4% of decks being categorized as beatdown, which would involve decks like Dinosaur or your more traditional go second OTK strategies. So now let's get to covering the performance of the top 5 most played decks for January. Starting with Drytron, they had about a 75% win rate among our top 25 players, compared to about a 61% win rate for Drytrons overall among all players on Dueling Book as mentioned before. When they won the die roll, they won about 82% of their matches, whereas if they lost the die roll, they won about 66% of their matches. So definitely a noticeable difference, and makes sense since Drytrons do want to go first and set up their Vanity's Ruler, as well as Herald of Mirage Lights, or maybe even Perfection, along with something like Herald of Orange Light in hand. So very powerful deck going first. In terms of their win percentage based on playstyle, they seem to do quite well against control and beatdown decks at around 80% win rate, compared to a slightly lower win rate of 68% against other aggro decks. Then we have Virtual World, which also had an impressive win rate of 75% among our top 25 players, compared to about 62% among all players on Dueling Book Online for Virtual World. When they won the die roll, they won about 81% of the time, compared to winning 65% of the time if they lost the die roll. Seems to have a similar difference as Drytrons, as Virtual World also like to go first and can have a powerful going first play by setting up a true King of all Calamities. The deck also seems to have a pretty balanced win percentage against different playstyles from around 74 to 80%. Okay, so from this deck and onward, the sample size drops off dramatically, so we have to take the numbers with a huge grain of salt, more so than the other decks listed before. So Infernoble Knight had a 78% win rate among the top 25 players, compared to about 60% among all players on Dueling Book. Now here's where the sample size is really affecting the numbers, because it had an absurd 95% win rate when going first and winning the die roll. If we had more data on this deck, I'm sure the win percentage would be lower than this in reality, but nonetheless it is still showing that it is a powerful deck when they win the die roll and can go first and set up their negates or VFD despite the lack of hand looping as before. When they lost the die roll, the win percentage definitely fell off dramatically to about 58%. In terms of win percentage based on going against different playstyles, seems to have struggled a bit against other aggro decks at 67%, while doing well against control decks at 87%. The 100% win rate against beatdown decks is a bit misleading because it was only based on 4 matches. Then we have Zoodiac variants, which didn't see nearly as much play among the top players compared to last month's meta-analysis. This is interesting since overall it's actually the 4th most played deck on Dueling Book. Among our top 25 players, the deck had a 74% win rate, compared to about 52 to 55% overall on Dueling Book depending on the Zoodiac variant. They had a bit more balanced win-loss percentage based on die roll, with a 79% win rate if they won the die roll versus 71% when they lost the die roll. Again, keep in mind of the extremely small sample size. For example, in last month's meta-analysis, the difference in win percentage for Zoodiac variants based on die roll was actually huge, like 85 versus 45%. So if we had more data, then Zoo may actually have a bigger difference, or perhaps the format is just a bit different now and maybe Zoodiac performs relatively equally whether they win the die roll or not. They also seem to have a pretty equal win percentage against different playstyles at around 71 to 77%. And finally, we have Dragon Link, a far cry from where they used to be, but at least it's still seeing some play. More susceptible to hand traps in their combo line now, but if left uninterrupted, they will put up an impressive board. Their win percentage was about 62%, which is alright, but certainly far lower than the other decks I mentioned up to now. Definitely performs much better when they win the die roll, winning about 73% in that case, compared to winning just 56% of the time when they lost the die roll. But again, really small sample size here, so interpret the numbers with caution. Seems to have pretty equal win rate going up against aggro or control decks while doing really well against beatdown decks, although this was only based on 3 matches. Alright guys, so that's it for another round of my meta-analysis, this time for the January format. Hope you found that useful, and make sure to subscribe so you can see more of these breakdowns on a monthly basis. Take care guys.